Admiral Nathaniel Hargrove had always believed that a Navy's greatness was not measured only by the number of ships in its harbors, nor by the tonnage of steel that filled its arsenals. True naval power, he often said, was the sum of imagination, fear, ambition, and geography. As he stood on the bridge of the USS Constitution, not the wooden frigate of 1812, but a modern guided missile destroyer that inherited the legendary name. The wind off the Pacific carried the same scent of untold horizons his predecessors had known. The fleet around him shimmered against the morning sun like a constellation of possibilities. Hargrove glanced at the young officer beside him, Lieutenant Jess Morales, who watched the radar screens with the reverence of someone studying ancient scripture. Jess had asked him a night before, over coffee in the wardroom, why the United States had become the world's foremost naval power. She hadn't meant it as a political question. She wanted a story, a thread she could follow from the age of sails to the age of satellites. Hargrove had promised to tell her the next morning. So as dawn lifted itself over a calm sea, he began. Jess, he said, people imagine it all started with battleships and global ambition. But the truth is stranger. The U.S. became a naval power almost reluctantly. And so he told her the story, his version shaped by decades of salt and steel. In the late 18th century, America was young, fragile, insecure. The newborn republic could barely fund its government, let alone a fleet. And yet the oceans around it were alive with threats. Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean, British impressment of sailors, French interference with trade. The United States had no empire, no overseas colonies, no ambition for global dominance. What it did have was something rarer, the necessity to survive. Necessity, Hargrove said, leaning on the rail, is the architect of naval destiny. The first ships of the early U.S. Navy were conceived not for conquest, but for protection. When Congress reluctantly authorized a small fleet to confront the Barbary corsairs, it planted a seed. The Navy won prestige not by overwhelming force, but by audacity, by sending frigates across the Atlantic to defend American honor when much older nations expected the fledgling republic to fold. Those early victories whispered to the world that the United States could stretch farther across the oceans than anyone imagined. Jess nodded, absorbing every word. But Hargrove continued, seeds don't become forests without time. Fast forward to the mid-19th century when the Civil War erupted. Most people think of the conflict as a land war of Gettysburg and Antietam, but on the waters, something revolutionary happened, the ironclads. When the USS Monitor faced the CSS Virginia, navies from London to Tokyo gasped. Wooden navies were finished. The age of iron and steam had arrived, and the United States was one of its midwives. The industrial might that fueled Union shipyards, rivers of steel, vast machine shops, innovative engineers, became the foundation of an industrial navy. The country learned that technological supremacy at sea could determine the outcome of a vast continental war. That lesson would never be forgotten. Still, Hargrove said, that wasn't the turning point. Not yet. The real shift came with one man, Alfred Thayer Mahan. Jess had heard the name, of course, every naval officer had. But she leaned closer as the admiral spoke, as though the old strategist's ghost might climb aboard the destroyer at any moment. Mahan, Hargrove said, was the prophet of sea power. In the 1890s, Mahan wrote that global greatness depended on maritime commerce, powerful fleets, and a network of strategic bases. His ideas exploded across the world. Kaiser Wilhelm read him. Queen Victoria read him. Theodore Roosevelt devoured his theories like scripture. Suddenly, the United States began to see itself not as a regional power, but as a potential global guardian of freedom, or, some whispered, a global empire in the making. It was Mahan who gave theoretical justification to actions that soon followed. The modernizing of the fleet, the acquisition of overseas bases after the Spanish-American War, the construction of steel battleships, and even the building of the Panama Canal, which let American ships jump between oceans like chess pieces across a board. And then, Hargrove said, we sent a message. He gestured to the horizon as if it still echoed with memory. In 1907, President Roosevelt dispatched the Great White Fleet, 16 gleaming battleships painted white for peacetime, to circumnavigate the globe. It was a spectacle, a peaceful show of force meant to announce that the United States was no longer a mere guardian of its shores. It was a nation with wings of steel and a reach that spanned continents. The world took notice, but Jess wanted to know more. Sir, she said, that explains how the U.S. began growing. But how did it surpass everyone else? Hargrove smiled. War, he said simply, and geography, and imagination. World War I introduced the U.S. Navy to coalition warfare and global logistics. Convoys, destroyers, anti-submarine tactics. The basics of modern naval strategy sharpened in the Atlantic's cold waters. The war ended quickly for the Americans, but the Navy emerged seasoned, respected, and hungry for innovation. Then came the interwar years, decades of treaty limitations, experimentation, and skepticism about battleships. The Washington Naval Treaty restricted fleet sizes, but paradoxically, it nurtured creativity. Forced to innovate within limits, the U.S. Navy invested in something few nations took seriously: aircraft carriers. Jess felt the engines of their destroyer hum through the deck, as if the ship nodded in agreement. At first, the carriers were derided as weak, even laughable. Who would choose flimsy flying machines over the armored might of battleships? Yet the Navy's aviators, rebellious, brilliant, and stubborn, pushed the boundaries. They practiced long-range strikes, coordinated attacks, and complex maneuvers. Then Hargrove said softly, Pearl Harbor happened. The attack that was meant to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet instead accelerated its evolution. The battleships that dominated naval doctrine were damaged and sunk. The aircraft carriers, by sheer luck, were out at sea. America's naval future had survived by accident. In the months and years that followed, the U.S. Navy transformed from an industrial power into a maritime titan. Shipyards along both coasts worked around the clock, outproducing every other nation combined. Carriers, cruisers, submarines, landing craft. An armada of unprecedented scale poured into the oceans. Numbers matter, Hargrove said, but willpower matters more. At Midway, a handful of American pilots turned the tide of the Pacific War. At Guadalcanal, sailors fought in brutal night battles at such close range they could smell cordite on the enemy's decks. Across island after island, the Navy learned the art of amphibious warfare, logistics, code-breaking, and long-range power projection. When Japan surrendered, the U.S. Navy was indisputably the strongest maritime force on Earth. And yet, he said, that was only the beginning. After World War II, most nations saw their fleets shrink. Empires collapsed. Budgets dried up. But the United States faced a new challenge: the Soviet Union. The oceans became the silent front lines of the Cold War. Nuclear deterrence required submarines that could lurk undetected for months. Rapid deployment demanded carrier strike groups ready to sail worldwide at a moment's notice. The U.S. Navy built not just ships, but entire philosophies: containment, forward presence, global reach. Jess listened as the Admiral spoke of the Polaris missile submarines, the evolution of nuclear carriers, and the intelligent ships that danced in the shadows. He described tense days during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when destroyers and submarines played cat-and-mouse games that may have saved the world. He described carrier sorties over Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf. He described the Navy's role in shaping a world where maritime trade, and by extension global stability, depended on open sea lanes protected by an American shield. It wasn't inevitable, Hargrove said. It was a choice. The United States chose to maintain a Navy capable of operating in every ocean, in every climate, against every threat. It built alliances with dozens of nations. It invested in technology that seemed impossible: Aegis radar, Tomahawk missiles, nuclear reactors that could power carriers for decades, satellite-guided navigation. Other nations measure their fleets, Hargrove said. We measure our commitments. He explained that American naval power was not simply about dominance. It was about deterrence, preventing wars by ensuring that no adversary could challenge the seas without consequence. It was about humanitarian missions, disaster relief, medical support, anti-piracy operations, and protecting the arteries of global trade. Jess found herself imagining the Pacific not as an empty blue expanse, but as a network of responsibilities stretching across thousands of miles. The Navy was not merely a fighting force. It was a guardian of movement, commerce, diplomacy, and dreams. And that, Hargrove said, is how we arrived here. But he wasn't finished. The admiral walked to the bow of the destroyer. Jess followed. The ocean glimmered beneath them, vast and inscrutable. You asked why the U.S. Navy became the world's leading naval power, he said. But the true question is, why does it remain one? He raised a hand and pointed toward the horizon, where the silhouettes of Allied ships, Japanese, Australian, British, sailed in formation for a joint exercise. The sea was no longer a battleground between empires, but a cooperative space where nations worked together to maintain stability. The reason, he continued, is that we adapted. Cyber warfare, unmanned systems, hypersonic weapons, satellite integration. The Navy was evolving again. Carriers now launched drones alongside fighters. Submarines listened to oceans with sensors that could detect the faintest hum. Destroyers tracked missile trajectories across continents. Logistics ships carried supplies to humanitarian zones faster than many governments could respond. And through it all, the men and women who served remained the constant force behind the steel. Hargrove turned to Jess. Ships rust, he said. Strategies change. Budgets rise and fall. But what makes a Navy truly powerful is the people who believe in its mission. Jess felt a warmth in her chest, a quiet pride, mixed with the weight of responsibility. The admiral continued. We became the world's leading naval power because we never allowed the oceans to become someone else's concern. We steward them. We learned from them. We listened to them. A long silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of the waves against the hull. Jess finally spoke. Sir, can a Navy ever stop growing? Can it say, we've done enough? Hargrove smiled sadly. The sea doesn't stop, he said. Neither can we. Later that day, Jess found herself standing alone on the deck. The sun was high now, scattering diamonds across the surface of the water. She thought about the Admiral's story, not as a historical lecture, but as a living memory of thousands of sailors before her. She pictured the fragile frigates battling pirates 2 centuries ago. She saw the ironclads clashing in smoke and fire. She imagined Mahan scribbling theories by lamplight, battleships steaming around the world in pristine formation, carriers launching planes into the deep blue during World War II. She saw submarines slipping through the Cold War's silent abyss, humanitarian teams delivering aid to disaster zones, convoys crossing oceans under the Navy's watchful shield. The story was not a straight line. It was a tapestry woven from necessity, vision, conflict, and courage. Jess realized something profound. Naval power was not about ruling the seas. It was about shaping the world in which the seas mattered. It was about ensuring the vast, often invisible networks of global life, trade, communication, cooperation, remained open and safe. She exhaled, letting the wind carry her breath across the deck. A voice came from behind her. It was Hargrove again. Do you understand now? Jess nodded. Yes, sir. The U.S. Navy became the world's leading naval power because it had to, but it stayed that way because it chose to. Hargrove's eyes sparkled with approval. Good. Then you're ready. Ready for what? For the next chapter, he said. Because the story isn't over. And now it's yours to help write. Jess stood straighter. The destroyer cut through the ocean with steady purpose, heading toward the joint exercise, a symbol of modern naval cooperation built on centuries of evolution. The sky above seemed impossibly wide, the horizon impossibly far, and yet she felt a sense of belonging within it. She wasn't just serving in a fleet. She was stepping into a legacy of power, not for its own sake, but for the protection of a world that depended on the sea. A legacy of sailors who once asked the same question she had, and then found the answer not in books, but in the vastness of the ocean. And as the ship's bow sliced through the swells, Jess Morales whispered a quiet promise that she would carry the story forward, that she would honor the centuries of sacrifice and innovation that built the Navy she now served, and that she would help ensure the seas remained a place where freedom and safety could flourish. Far out on the horizon, the Allied ships shimmered like a future waiting to be claimed.